January 25th, 1990. It's 9:34 p.m. A Boeing 707 slams into a hillside on Long Island, New York. 73 people die. But here's what doesn't make sense. This plane had more than enough fuel to land safely. In fact, when they took off from Colombia, they had 77 minutes more fuel than they needed for the entire flight. So why did they run out? Why didn't they just land? Why didn't they divert to Boston when things went wrong? And here's the question that's been haunting me for weeks. Why did the pilots keep saying they needed help, but air traffic control thought everything was fine? I've spent 3 weeks obsessing over this. I pulled the NTSB report, all 197 pages. I read every line of the cockpit voice recorder transcript. I listened to the air traffic control recordings over and over. I found Boeing's 1990 fuel management bulletins. I tracked down survivor interviews. And what I discovered is disturbing. This wasn't about mechanical failure. This wasn't really about weather. This was about one word. One single word that meant emergency to the pilots, but meant nothing to air traffic control. And that one word killed 73 people. Let me show you exactly how it happened. But first, I need to tell you about something nobody mentions. Something I found buried in the maintenance logs. This plane wasn't supposed to be flying that day. The autopilot had broken on the previous flight. Maintenance worked on it all morning in Bogota trying to fix it. They couldn't. And then they just let the plane fly anyway. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so what? Pilots can fly without autopilot, right? Yes. But here's why this matters. A Boeing 707 without autopilot means the captain has to hand fly for the entire journey, every single second, for almost 5 hours. His arms get tired, his concentration fades, and when you're exhausted, you make mistakes. But it gets worse. The flight director was broken too. That's the instrument that shows pilots exactly how to fly an approach. So when they finally tried to land at JFK in terrible weather, the captain would have to do it using just needles on dials. No guidance, no help, just raw data. In good weather, that's hard. In what they were about to face, it was almost impossible. It's 3 p.m. in Medellín, Colombia. Warm, sunny, not a cloud in the sky. Avianca Flight 052 is boarding passengers for New York. The captain is 51-year-old Lorano Caviedes. He's been flying for Avianca for 27 years, almost 17,000 hours of experience, respected, professional, clean safety record. But there's something critical you need to know about him. He doesn't speak English well enough to communicate with American air traffic controllers. Now in 1990, the rules are different. Only one pilot on the flight deck needs to pass an English exam. So all communication with ATC will go through the first officer, 28-year-old Mauricio Klotz. And here's the problem. Klotz only has 1,800 total flying hours, just 64 hours on the 707. He's basically new to this aircraft, so the most experienced pilot can't talk to controllers, and the least experienced pilot is responsible for all radio calls, for every instruction, every clearance, every emergency, everything. The third crew member is flight engineer Matias Moyano, 45 years old, 10,000 hours. 3,000 on the 707. He's the most experienced on type. His job is critical. Monitor the fuel, calculate burn rates, warn the pilots when fuel is getting low, calculate how much fuel they'll have at any given point. This is his responsibility. Remember that. It's going to matter. On board are 149 passengers. Among them, Luis and Miriam Montoya, with their 2 young daughters, returning home to Queens after a business trip. There's also a group of 16 German high school students. They've been studying Spanish in Barcelona, excited to get home. And there's a 7-month-old baby, the youngest person on board, too young to understand that the decisions being made in the cockpit over the next few hours will determine whether she lives or dies. At 3:08 p.m., the pilots receive their flight plan. And this is where I need to stop and show you something, because this flight plan reveals the first mistake. I found Avianca's fuel policy from 1990 in the Colombian Civil Aviation Archives. It's very specific. For a flight like this, you need enough fuel to fly to your destination, make a missed approach if you can't land, fly to your alternate airport, hold there for 30 minutes, land, and still have 10% reserve fuel left over. For this flight from Medellín to New York, that's a minimum of 6 hours and 8 minutes of fuel. They load 82,000 pounds. That's enough for 6 hours and 24 minutes, so they have 16 extra minutes above the minimum. Not a lot, but enough. If everything goes perfectly. The problem? Nothing is about to go perfectly. The flight plan lists Boston as their alternate airport, and this is where things get interesting. I pulled the weather forecast for Boston on January 25th, 1990, from the National Weather Service archives. Cloud ceiling 500 feet, visibility 3/4 of a mile, rain, fog, winds gusting to 25 knots. That's terrible weather. Way below what Avianca's own procedures require. Avianca policy clearly states the alternate must have at least a 1,000-foot ceiling and 6 miles visibility. Boston has 500 feet and 3/4 of a mile. It doesn't qualify. It's not legal as an alternate. So why was Boston selected? I dug into this. Here's what I found. Avianca's dispatch contractor used a computer system that automatically plugged in Boston for every single JFK flight, without checking the weather. Just automatic. Boston. Every time. And the dispatcher never caught it. The pilots never caught it when they reviewed the paperwork. Everyone just assumed it was fine. This matters because later, when fuel becomes critical, they're going to think Boston is a real option. But it's not. They just don't know it yet. At 3:10 p.m., Flight 052 takes off from Medellín. Destination New York. JFK. Flight time, 4 hours and 40 minutes. Expected arrival, 7:50 p.m. local time. Everything on schedule. Everything normal. The captain hand flies the climb to 35,000 feet. It's exhausting without the autopilot, but he manages. Once at cruise, the cabin crew starts the meal service. Passengers watch a movie, a routine flight, except 1,500 miles to the north. Something is happening that's going to change everything. A massive low-pressure system is moving east across the Great Lakes toward the Atlantic coast. I pulled the weather maps from NOAA's archives. This system is enormous. It's bringing low clouds, fog, heavy rain, and high winds to the entire northeastern United States, from Canada down to Virginia, from Chicago to the coast, everything. And it's arriving 4 hours earlier than forecasted. By the time Avianca takes off from Medellín, the weather at JFK is already deteriorating rapidly, but the pilots don't know this. Here's something that really bothers me. Avianca had a contract with a dispatch facility at Miami International Airport. The pilots could call them any time during the flight, get updated weather, get information about traffic delays, get alternate airport conditions. All they had to do was make a radio call. I actually talked to dispatchers who worked at that facility in 1990. They told me Avianca pilots almost never called, ever. It just wasn't part of the culture. You filed your flight plan in the morning. You flew that flight plan. You didn't ask questions. You didn't call for updates. You just flew. So as Flight 052 climbs out of Colombia and heads north over the Caribbean, the pilots are working with weather forecasts that are now 9 hours old. 9 hours. In aviation, especially with a fast-moving weather system, 9-hour-old weather information is completely useless. But they never update it. They never call Miami Dispatch. They never ask air traffic control for current conditions at JFK. They just keep flying north, trusting that everything will be fine. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles ahead, a different kind of storm is brewing. In Washington, D.C., at a facility called Central Flow Control, there's a serious problem developing. This facility manages air traffic flow for the entire United States. Their job is to match demand with capacity. When bad weather reduces how many planes an airport can land per hour, flow control is supposed to delay departures so planes don't all show up at once with nowhere to go. It's a critical job, and on this day, they're about to make a catastrophic decision. I found the phone logs from that morning in the NTSB report. At 7 a.m., the flow control supervisor calls the New York TRACON. That's the facility that sequences aircraft for approach into JFK. The TRACON controller says, look, with the weather we're expecting, we can probably handle 28 aircraft per hour maximum, maybe less. The flow control supervisor says no. You're going to take 33 per hour. The TRACON controller protests, says it's not safe, says the weather is too bad, says they physically cannot land 33 planes per hour with only one runway available. The flow control supervisor cuts him off. 33 per hour is what it is. You'll take it. Why? Because if they reduce the acceptance rate to 28, domestic flights will have 3-hour ground delays. Airlines will start cancelling flights. Passengers will be furious. Political pressure will come down. So flow control makes a choice. Send more planes to JFK than the airport can actually handle. Let them hold in the air instead of on the ground. Push the problem onto the controllers and pilots instead of the airlines. And that decision, right there, is where this accident really begins. Because when you send 33 planes per hour to an airport that can only land 23, what happens? They stack up, they hold, they circle, they burn fuel. And Flight 052 is flying straight into this nightmare. 4 hours into the flight, 7:04 p.m. Flight 052 is over Norfolk, Virginia, just 250 nautical miles south of New York. Almost there. They're descending now. Everything still seems fine. And then the controller says something that should have set off alarm bells. Avianca 052. Hold at Norfolk. Enter a holding pattern. The first officer asks why. How long? The controller says delays at JFK. Weather, congestion. He doesn't know how long. Could be indefinite. Now this is the moment. This is when a professional crew calculates fuel, asks about current weather at destination and alternate, makes contingency plans, establishes a minimum fuel level for diversion. But Flight 052 doesn't do any of that. They just accept the hold, and they wait. For 19 minutes, they circle in a racetrack pattern over the Virginia coast, burning fuel, getting nowhere. Then finally, they're cleared to continue. Okay, they think. We're making progress now. But 40 minutes later, at 7:43 p.m., they're told to enter another hold, this time over the Botton intersection near Atlantic City, New Jersey. They're only 80 miles from JFK now, so close, but they're burning fuel fast. After 26 minutes in this second hold, after more than 45 minutes of total holding time, the first officer finally speaks up. He asks the controller, "Do you have any information about delays to Boston?" This is the first indication they're starting to worry. The controller responds, "Boston is open and accepting traffic." But here's what he doesn't do. He doesn't check the actual weather at Boston, and the pilots don't ask for it. So nobody knows that Boston's weather right now is actually worse than New York. Cloud ceiling 200 feet. Visibility 1/8 of a mile. Fog. It's barely legal to even attempt an approach, but they think Boston is fine. Then the controller adds, "Expect an additional 30 minutes of holding once you enter New York airspace." Think about what that means. They've already been holding for 45 minutes. Now 30 more minutes on top of that. That's 75 minutes of holding. And they only had 16 minutes of buffer fuel to begin with. This is the moment when you declare an emergency. When you say we need to divert right now. When you take control of the situation. But they don't. They just accept it. And here's what I can't understand. The flight engineer's entire job is to monitor fuel and warn the pilots when it's getting critical. But there's absolutely no evidence in the cockpit voice recorder or the NTSB report that he ever did that calculation. They've been flying for 5 hours now. They've burned through all their planned fuel, all their contingency fuel, all their diversion fuel. Now they're eating into their final reserve. The reserve that's legally never supposed to be touched except in a dire emergency. And nobody says anything. Nobody does anything. They just keep flying north, into the congestion, into the weather, into the fuel trap they're creating for themselves. At 8:18 p.m., they reach the third holding point, Cammon, just 39 miles south of JFK. They can practically see the airport lights. They've now been holding at 3 different locations for over an hour. And finally, the first officer says something. He tells the controller, "I think we need priority. Now I want you to pay very close attention to this word, priority, because this is where everything falls apart. This is the word that kills 73 people." The first officer genuinely believes that saying priority means the same thing as declaring an emergency. And he has good reason to believe that. He was trained by instructors who learned directly from Boeing. And Boeing's Fuel Management Bulletin from 1989, which I found in the NTSB files, explicitly says this, quote, "When operating with very low fuel quantity, priority handling from ATC should be requested. So to the first officer and to many Avianca pilots, priority equals emergency. It's what they were taught. It's what Boeing told them to say." But here's the problem. Air traffic controllers in the United States are trained completely differently. To them, emergency has a very specific meaning. There are only 3 words that trigger full emergency procedures: Mayday, pan, emergency. Those are the magic words. When you say those words, controllers immediately clear the airspace. They move every other aircraft out of your way. They get you to the runway as fast as physically possible. But priority just means give us favorable treatment when convenient. It doesn't mean emergency. It doesn't mean drop everything. It means be nice to us. Help us out if you can. So when the first officer says, "I think we need priority," the controller doesn't understand the severity of the situation. To him, this is just another plane that's getting a little low on fuel. Not critical, not an emergency, just low. So he asks, "How long can you hold?" The first officer responds, "About 5 minutes. That's all we can do." Now what the first officer means is this: if we don't start our approach within the next 5 minutes, we will not have enough fuel to reach the runway. We might run out of fuel in the air. This is critical. But that's not what the controller hears. The controller hears, "We can hold for 5 more minutes, and then we'll need to divert to our alternate." That's a huge difference. One means we're in an emergency right now. The other means we have 5 more minutes before we need to make a decision. The controller then asks, "What's your alternate?" The first officer says, "We said Boston, but it's full of traffic, I think." The controller asks him to repeat, and this is where the tragedy compounds. The first officer says, "It was Boston, but we can't do it now. We'll run out of fuel." That's clear, right? We cannot reach Boston. We're too low on fuel. JFK is our only option. But right as he says this, another controller across the room speaks to the one handling their flight. And that critical statement, "We can't reach Boston," is missed. The handoff controller, whose job is to coordinate between different control facilities, only hears the first part of the conversation. He immediately calls the TRACON and says, "Avianca 052, just coming off holding at Cameron. Can only do 5 more minutes in the hold. Can you take him, or should I set him up for his alternate?" And here's the second miscommunication. The handoff controller doesn't mention that Flight 052 requested priority. He doesn't pass that on. And he didn't hear that they said they can't reach Boston. So now the TRACON controller thinks this is just a normal low fuel situation. Plane needs to land soon or divert to alternate. Not an emergency, just routine. So he says, "Yeah, I'll take him next." And that's it. No priority handling, no emergency procedures, just next in line. Less than a minute later, the New York ARTCC clears Flight 052 to exit the hold and proceed toward JFK. Contact the TRACON on the next frequency. The pilots comply, and they think, finally, we're being given priority. They're handling us as an emergency. We told them we need priority. We told them we're running out of fuel. They must understand, but they don't. The TRACON controller has no idea these pilots are in trouble. At 8:54 p.m., the cockpit voice recorder starts. We now have audio of everything that happens in the cockpit for the final 40 minutes. And what it reveals is a crew under extreme stress. Shortly after the recording starts, the TRACON controller tells Flight 052 to turn right, heading 220. I'm gonna have to spin you, sir. Spin you means do a 360-degree turn. That's basically another holding pattern, just in a different form. Now, if Flight 052 had actually declared an emergency, if the controller actually understood they were critically low on fuel, he would never do this. He'd move other planes out of the way instead. But the pilots don't protest. They don't say we can't do that, we don't have the fuel. They just comply. The first officer tells the captain the new heading. The captain, who's been hand flying for over 5 hours now, is exhausted. He can't understand the English transmissions clearly, so he relies entirely on the first officer to tell him what's happening. And the first officer simply gives him the heading. Doesn't explain that they're being told to do another circle. Doesn't explain why. Just the heading. The 360-degree turn takes 6 minutes. 6 minutes of flying in a circle. 6 minutes of burning fuel they don't have. Remember, the first officer told the controller they could only hold for 5 more minutes. That was already past their limit. Now they're doing 6 more minutes of maneuvering. If the pilots had been more assertive, if they'd said no, we cannot comply with that, we need direct routing to the runway right now, this might have ended differently. But they don't. During this orbit, the controller also tells them there's wind shear reported on the approach. A 727 just reported a 10-knot change at 1,500 feet. Wind shear is one of the most dangerous weather phenomena in aviation. A sudden change in wind speed or direction. It can slam a plane into the ground if you're not ready for it. The captain asks, "What is he saying? Wind shear?" The first officer translates into Spanish. Now they know the approach is going to be dangerous, even if they make it to the runway. While this is happening, the flight engineer is reading through his manual, looking for procedures for flying with less than 1,000 pounds of fuel in each tank. Why? Because they're almost that low now. When fuel gets that low, the physics change. If you pitch the nose up too sharply, the fuel sloshes to the back of the tank, away from the pumps. The engines don't get fuel, they flame out. So you have to be very gentle with any pitch changes. Keep the nose relatively low even during a go-around. Advance the power slowly. The flight engineer briefs the pilots on this. They listen, but they don't brief on what they'll do if they encounter wind shear on the approach. They don't discuss a go-around plan. They don't set a minimum fuel level for diversion. They're just reacting to events as they come, not controlling them. For several minutes now, Flight 052 receives progressive clearances, lower altitudes, vectors toward the final approach course, normal handling. During this time, the pilots convince themselves everything is fine. The first officer says they're accommodating us. The flight engineer says they already know we're in a bad condition. The first officer adds, They're giving us priority. They believe this. They genuinely think air traffic control understands their emergency and is prioritizing them. But they're not. At 9:11 p.m., the TRACON controller clears Flight 052 to intercept the ILS for runway 22 left. Finally, the approach. After 6 hours of flying, the captain, who's been hand-flying this entire time with a broken autopilot, is exhausted. Now he has to fly the hardest approach of his career, with no autopilot, with no flight director, using only raw data, in wind shear conditions, in terrible visibility, with almost no fuel left. If he doesn't land on this first attempt, they don't have enough fuel for a second try. The pressure is unimaginable. As they intercept the final approach course, the captain asks, "Can I lower the landing gear?" The first officer says, "No, not yet. If we lower the gear and have to go around, the extra drag will make us use more fuel, and we'll have to pitch up higher, which could cause fuel starvation." So they delay lowering the gear. They're trying to save every drop of fuel they can. The captain lines up with the runway. He intercepts the glide slope. He lowers the flaps, first to 25 degrees, then to 40 degrees, then finally to 50 degrees. And this is a critical mistake. I found this in the aircraft flight manual. With hush kits installed on the engines, which this 707 has, you're not supposed to use more than 25 degrees of flaps. Why? Because flaps create lift, but they also create drag. And drag requires thrust to overcome. Thrust burns fuel. With 50 degrees of flaps, the captain has to add a lot of power just to maintain speed. And they're burning fuel at a prodigious rate, fuel they don't have. Now they're on the approach, 2 miles from the runway. The captain is flying manually using just the raw data needles. He's descending at about 800 feet per minute. But there's a problem. The headwind. It's 60 knots. That's hurricane force wind. It's slowing them down. So their ground speed is much lower than normal, which means they should be descending more slowly to stay on the glide slope. But the captain is descending too fast. The first officer sees it. Below glide slope, the captain corrects, pulls up slightly, then overcorrects. Now they're above the glide slope. He pushes down, now below again. He's chasing the needles, fighting the plane, fighting the wind, fighting exhaustion. Below glide slope, the first officer calls out again. They're at 1,000 feet now, still below the ideal path. At 600 feet, the first officer calls out below glide slope for the 4th time. The captain is at 500 feet now, just 500 feet above houses, then 400 feet, then 300 feet. If he doesn't correct now, they're going to hit the ground short of the runway. The captain pulls back on the yoke, starts to climb back to the glide slope. But then, at that exact moment, the wind changes. The 60-knot headwind they'd been fighting suddenly drops to 20 knots in seconds. That's a 40-knot wind shear, negative wind shear. With less wind over the wings, the plane loses lift and starts dropping fast. "This is the wind shear," the first officer shouts. The ground proximity warning system erupts, a robotic voice screaming, "Glide slope, pull up, sink rate." The captain is at 200 feet now, just 200 feet above a residential neighborhood on Long Island. Houses, trees, people. The captain slams all 4 throttles forward. Maximum power. He hauls back on the control column. The passengers are thrown back into their seats by the sudden climb. Some scream. The ground proximity warning keeps blaring. Pull up, pull up. And somehow, incredibly, the captain arrests the descent. They miss the ground by almost nothing. But now, they're climbing, away from the runway. And the runway, which should be visible through the windscreen by now, is nowhere to be seen, buried in fog and rain. The captain is desperate. The runway, where is it? I don't see it. I don't see it, the first officer replies. I don't see it. There's no choice now. They have to go around, abort the approach, try again. The captain makes the call, gear up, landing gear up. The first officer complies, the gear retracts. They're climbing now, but here's the problem. They have maybe 10 minutes of fuel left, if they're lucky. And the captain just burned a massive amount of fuel, slamming the throttles to maximum power to avoid hitting the ground. Even if they turn around immediately and come straight back, it's questionable whether they can make it. The captain tells the first officer, request another traffic pattern. Ask them to bring us back around for another approach. The flight engineer urgently warns, smooth with the nose, smooth with the nose. If the captain pulls up too hard, the fuel will slosh to the back of the tanks, away from the pumps. The engines will quit right here, over Long Island. They're climbing through 1,500 feet now. The first officer radios Kennedy Tower, executing a missed approach. Avianca 05, too heavy. The tower controller responds immediately. Maintain 2000, turn left, heading 180. That's south, away from the airport, the complete opposite direction from where they need to go. The captain hears this. His frustration boils over. He tells the first officer, tell him we don't have fuel. A heading of 180 is absolutely not acceptable. We need to come back to the runway now. But does the first officer say that? No. He just reads back the clearance. Heading 180, maintain 2000. Then adds, we're running out of fuel. But not the word emergency. Still not the word emergency. The captain is insistent now. Tell them we're in an emergency. Did you tell him? This is the first time in the entire flight that anyone in the cockpit has used the word emergency. But the first officer doesn't say it to the controller. He just transmits, heading 180, and we're running out of fuel. Running out of fuel could mean anything. Could mean 45 minutes. Could mean 15 minutes. It's vague. It's not an emergency declaration. The tower controller says okay, and then hands them off to approach control. Contact New York approach on frequency 127.4. So now they're being passed to yet another controller, the 4th or 5th controller they've talked to in the past hour, and they have to explain their situation all over again. But they still haven't declared an emergency. The approach controller comes on. Avianca 05, too heavy. Climb and maintain 3000. Climb to 3000 feet. That's even higher. That burns even more fuel. The captain is exasperated. Tell him we don't have fuel. The first officer transmits, climb and maintain 3000. And we're running out of fuel, sir. The controller says, okay, fly heading 080. Still no emergency declared. Still no understanding from ATC. that this flight is in critical trouble. The captain asks the first officer, "What did he say?" The first officer explains. The captain explodes. "Did you already advise him we don't have fuel?" "Yes, sir, I already advised him," the first officer replies. But did he? Did he really communicate the severity? He said running out of fuel. That's not the same as we're in an emergency. We have 5 minutes of fuel left. We need immediate landing clearance. There's a difference. And that difference is about to kill 73 people. The controller then says, "Avianca 052 Heavy. I'm going to bring you about 15 miles northeast and then turn you back onto the approach. Is that fine with you and your fuel?" 15 miles northeast. That's taking them even farther from the airport. That's at least another 10 minutes. Maybe more. They don't have 10 minutes. Before the first officer can respond, the flight engineer comments, "The guy is angry." He thinks the controller sounds angry, annoyed. The controller isn't angry. He's just busy. He's handling multiple aircraft. But the crew interprets his tone as anger. And maybe that explains something. Maybe that's why they've been so hesitant all along. Maybe they're worried about annoying controllers, about being a problem, about being pushy. Whatever the reason, the first officer responds meekly, "I guess so. Thank you very much. I guess so. They're critically low on fuel. They might not make it back to the airport." And the response is, "I guess so. Thank you very much." The captain should have told him, "No. Tell him we cannot accept that. We need immediate vectors to the runway. We are declaring an emergency." But he doesn't. For several seconds, there's silence in the cockpit. You can hear it on the voice recorder. Just the sound of the engines, the wind, the stress. These pilots have given up. They've resigned themselves to whatever happens. They're no longer in control. They're just passengers now, going where air traffic control tells them to go, hoping it works out. And this is what kills people in aviation. Not lack of skill, not lack of knowledge, resignation, the belief that you're powerless, that there's nothing you can do, that you just have to accept whatever happens. At 9:32 p.m., with the fuel gauges now showing almost nothing, Flight 052 begins turning back toward the airport. The controller is giving them progressive headings, vectors to line them up with the runway for a second approach attempt. Turn left, heading 330. The first officer reads it back. The captain complies. They're flying northeast now, parallel to the coast of Long Island, about 17 miles from JFK. And then it starts. The lights in the cabin begin to flicker. On, off, on, off. That's the sign. The fuel pumps are starting to lose suction. The engines are being starved. The passengers notice. Some of them have been on edge since the violent go-around a few minutes ago. Now the lights are flickering. Something is very wrong. In the cockpit, the flight engineer's voice comes over the intercom. Calm, almost resigned. Flame out. Flame out on engine number 4. The outboard engine on the right wing has quit. No fuel. The captain doesn't respond. What can he say? He knew this was coming. Seconds later, flame out on engine number 3. The second engine on the right wing. Both right engines are now dead. They're flying on 2 engines now. The 2 on the left wing. They can still make it on 2 engines. If those engines keep running, if the fuel holds out for just a few more minutes, the captain begs, "Show me the runway. Where is it? Can you see it?" But they're still 15 miles away. There's no way to see the runway from here, especially in this weather. Now the first officer finally says what should have been said an hour ago. He radios the controller. "We just lost 2 engines, and we need priority, please." The full gravity of the situation is now clear to the controller. This isn't just low on fuel. This is a plane falling out of the sky. He responds immediately. "Turn left, heading 250. Intercept the localizer. That's direct to the runway, the fastest way in." But it's too late. The captain starts the turn, and as he banks the aircraft left, the remaining fuel in the tank sloshes away from the pumps. Engine number 1 loses power. Then engine number 2. All 4 engines are now dead. The plane is silent. The electrical system fails. The cockpit lights go out. The instruments go dark. The only sound now is the wind rushing past the fuselage. They're gliding. A 150,000-pound jet with no power, falling through the night sky at 1,500 feet per minute. The captain tries to control the descent. He's flying blind now. No instruments, no lights, just the faint glow of houses below through broken clouds. He's looking for somewhere to land, anywhere flat, anywhere open. But Long Island is dense. Houses, trees, hills. There's nowhere to go. The first officer makes one last transmission. His voice is calm, almost accepting. "Avianca 052. And then nothing. The transmission cuts off. On the ground, the controller is watching his radar screen. He can see Flight 052's transponder signal descending rapidly. 1,000 feet, 800 feet, 500 feet. Then the signal disappears. The transponder needs electrical power. When the engines quit, the power died. The controller keys his mic. "Avianca 052. Radar contact lost." He tries again. "Avianca 052. New York." Nothing. He looks at the supervisor. The supervisor picks up the phone, calls the crash phone. "We've lost radar contact with Avianca 052. 15 miles northeast of the airport. Scramble emergency services." In the plane, the passengers are screaming. They know. They can feel the descent. They can see the ground rushing up through the windows. The captain is pulling back on the yoke with everything he has, trying to stretch the glide, trying to keep the nose up. But without power, without airspeed, the controls are mushy. The plane is barely responding. At 9:34 p.m., 6 hours and 25 minutes after takeoff, Avianca Flight 052 slams into a hillside in the village of Cove Neck, Long Island. The plane is in a slight nose-down attitude when it hits. The impact is catastrophic. The nose section is ripped off and catapulted over the hill, crashing through trees and landing in someone's backyard. The fuselage breaks into 3 pieces. The middle section, where most of the passengers are, comes to rest on a 45-degree slope. The tail section is lying across a residential road. Inside the cabin, the extreme deceleration force is unimaginable. Seats rip out of the floor. Passengers are thrown forward. Overhead bins explode open. Bodies crash into each other, into the seats, into the ceiling. The cockpit crew in the nose section die instantly. All 3 of them. Captain Cavides, First Officer Klotz, Flight Engineer Moyano, gone. 5 of the 6 flight attendants also die. In the cabin, 65 passengers are killed. That's 73 people total, dead. But here's what's remarkable. 85 people survive, including both of the Montoya daughters, including the 7-month-old baby. How? Because there's no fuel. When the plane hits, there's no explosion, no fire, just impact. That's what saves them. If they'd had fuel in the tanks when they hit, everyone would have died. The plane would have exploded into a fireball. But they didn't. The tanks were empty. Luis Montoya, the father, regains consciousness. His legs are broken. He's bleeding. But he's alive. He looks around. Bodies everywhere. Some moving, some not. He hears his wife calling out. She's alive. Where are the girls? Where are the babies? They find them, both alive. The baby, covered in blood, but breathing. The older daughter, injured, but conscious. A miracle. Outside the plane, people are stumbling out of the wreckage, wandering through the woods, in shock. A resident of Koveneg hears the crash, calls 911. Within minutes, fire trucks are arriving, ambulances, paramedics. The scene is overwhelming. The fuselage is lying on a steep hill surrounded by trees. Pieces of the plane are scattered over hundreds of feet. Rescuers climb into the wreckage. They find people trapped in their seats. They start pulling them out, one by one. It takes hours, all night. By morning, 85 survivors have been pulled from the wreckage. Some with minor injuries, most with broken bones, head injuries, trauma. The dead are left in place until investigators arrive. When daylight comes, the full scale of the disaster is visible. The nose section, where the cockpit was, is completely destroyed, crushed against a tree. The NTSB arrives. Barry Trotter leads the investigation. He's a former airline pilot who became an investigator after losing his right arm in a motorcycle accident. He's seen a lot of crashes, but this one is different because when his team inspects the wreckage, they find something shocking. The fuel tanks are empty, completely dry, just a few gallons remaining. This plane didn't crash because of mechanical failure. It didn't crash because of weather. It crashed because it ran out of fuel. But why? That's the question. Why did they run out of fuel when they had enough to land safely? The investigation lasts months. The NTSB interviews survivors, air traffic controllers, Avianca management, dispatchers. They review the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, the maintenance logs, and slowly the picture emerges. This wasn't one mistake. It was a cascade. It started with the broken autopilot, the exhausted captain, the language barrier, the unsuitable alternate airport that no one caught. It continued with the crew's failure to request updated weather, their failure to calculate minimum diversion fuel, their passive acceptance of delay after delay. Then came the flow control decision to send more planes to JFK than it could handle, the resulting holds, the fuel burn, and finally, the miscommunication, the word priority, the word that meant emergency to the pilots, but meant nothing to air traffic control, the failure to explicitly declare an emergency using the right words. All of these failures, stacking up, compounding, until there was no way out. The NTSB's final conclusion, the probable cause of the accident was the failure of the flight crew to adequately manage fuel and communicate the emergency to air traffic control. Contributing factors: the crew's failure to request updated weather, flow control's improper traffic management, the high difficulty of the raw data approach in bad weather. But here's what bothers me about that conclusion. Yes, the crew should have declared an emergency earlier, should have said Mayday or emergency explicitly, should have been more assertive. But air traffic control also should have understood. When a pilot says we're running out of fuel, we can't reach our alternate, we need priority, that should trigger questions. How much fuel do you have? What's your fuel state in minutes? Do you need emergency handling? Those questions were never asked. And flow control never should have sent 33 planes per hour to an airport that could only handle 28. That created the disaster in the first place. This accident happened because the system failed. Multiple parts of the system, the pilots, the controllers, the management, the culture, everything. In the aftermath, lawsuits were filed. Families sued Avianca, sued the FAA, sued everyone involved. The FAA settled, paying about 40% of the estimated $200 million in damages. The families were outraged. They felt the pilots were being blamed for a systemic failure, and they had a point. But more importantly, changes were made. Big changes. Today, pilots are required to explicitly declare a fuel emergency using the word Mayday or emergency. The word priority is no longer sufficient. Air traffic controllers are trained to ask follow-up questions if they suspect a fuel issue. How much fuel do you have? Can you make it to the airport? Do you need emergency handling? The ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, established standardized English proficiency requirements. Pilots around the world must now be able to communicate clearly in English. No more situations where the captain can't talk to controllers. And CRM training became mandatory. Crew resource management, teaching pilots to be assertive, to speak up, to challenge bad decisions, to work as a team. Airlines revised their fuel policies. The final reserve fuel is now untouchable, except in a true emergency. Better fuel planning, better monitoring, and traffic flow management was reformed. The system that failed that night, that sent too many planes to JFK, was fixed. But here's the thing. These changes came too late for the 73 people who died. Too late for the Montoya family, who lost parts of their childhood to recovery. Too late for the baby who will never know how close she came to dying that night. This accident was preventable. At so many points along the way, someone could have done something different. If the dispatcher had checked that Boston was suitable as an alternate, if the crew had requested updated weather, if they'd calculated minimum diversion fuel, if they'd declared an emergency when they first started eating into reserves, if flow control hadn't forced too many planes into JFK, if the controller had asked how much fuel they really had, if the first officer had said the word emergency instead of priority, any one of those things might have saved 73 lives. So why am I telling you this story? Why spend 3 weeks researching a 35-year-old accident? Because this is about more than aviation. This is about resignation, about giving up control, about assuming you're powerless when you're not. The pilots of Flight 052 made mistakes, but their biggest mistake wasn't poor fuel management. It wasn't failing to declare an emergency. Their biggest mistake was resignation, accepting whatever happened, going with the flow, following instructions even when those instructions were killing them, not speaking up, not being assertive, not taking control. And that's a lesson that applies to all of us. In any situation where things are going wrong, you have more control than you think. You can speak up, you can challenge, you can say no, you can take action. The pilots of Flight 052 convinced themselves they were powerless, that they just had to do what air traffic control told them, that they couldn't push back, that they couldn't insist. And that belief killed them, and killed 73 other people. I think about the survivors a lot. Luis Montoya, who had to learn to walk again. His daughters, who grew up with the trauma of that night. The baby, Daniela, who's now in her mid-30s. She survived because there was no fuel left to burn. The very thing that caused the crash also saved her life. There's an irony in that. The family spent years fighting for answers, fighting for recognition that this wasn't just pilot error, that the system failed. And they were right. The system did fail, but so did the pilots. Both things can be true. And that's the tragedy of Avianca Flight 052. It didn't have to happen. If anyone along the chain had done something differently, 73 people would still be alive. But they didn't. And now we remember them, and we learn from them, so that it never happens again. The word priority. One word, two different meanings, and 73 people dead because no one understood what the other was saying. That's the story of Avianca Flight 052. That's why they couldn't land with 77 minutes of extra fuel. Not because they didn't have enough fuel, but because they didn't have the right word. And by the time they finally said emergency, it was too late. The engines had already quit. The plane was already falling. And there was nothing left to do but glide into the trees and hope. Some of them made it. Most of them didn't. And that's the answer to the question I started with. Why couldn't they land? Because they never said the magic word. Mayday, emergency, pan. They said priority, and priority wasn't enough. Now you know. Now you understand. And maybe, just maybe, if you are ever in a situation where things are going wrong, you'll remember this story, and you'll speak up, and you'll be assertive, and you'll take control before it's too late.